welcome back to the Crazy 3D official channel. Today, we're going to be building a real staple, the iconic red barrel. This is part one of a two-part series, and in this episode, we're focusing on the modeling side of things. I'll be taking you through my Blender workflow, covering both high and low poly techniques, getting our UVs prepped for Substance Painter, and making sure we can export it cleanly. Let's jump in. Here I have the reference image that I picked from the internet, with some measurements for the height and width. Now, I could do this without a reference image, but this one needs to be pretty exact in its measurements, so reference it is. Alright, here's our default cube. Now, for once, I'm not going to delete it. Instead, we're going to make it 23 inches wide and 32 inches tall. That's roughly 90 centimeters for those of you using the metric system, which is arguably superior, but hey, we'll use both today. Okay, so I'm using the box as a reference for the overall dimensions. I'll add a plane and position it so it's facing our view. This plane will act as a guide for creating those three characteristic bumps on the barrel. Now I'm going to delete one edge of the plane and snap the remaining vertices to the box to get the correct width. Next, I'll select the vertical edge and subdivide it, making it 3 segments. Now I'll select the 3 vertices and scale them to evenly spread them. Okay, now let's select the topmost vertex and start extruding it to form the shape of the barrel. Remember to turn on Snap to Grid and keep an eye on those 3 guide vertices to ensure the bumps are evenly spaced. After I'm done with the general shape of the barrel, I'll select the outer shape and separate it from the guide by pressing P for separate and choosing Selection. Then I'll extrude the top vertex to create the shape of the top lip for the barrel, and I'll do the same for the bottom. Don't worry about the actual lid and the bottom cap just yet. We'll address those later once the main barrel shape is formed. Okay, the barrel silhouette is looking good, but I think those bumps could use a little refinement. I'm going to make them a bit thicker and move them down by 1 grid unit each. That should give them a bit more presence. Now, to finalize the barrel shape, we'll add a screw modifier. Boom! Does that look like a barrel? I just need to set which axis the shape revolves around to actually make it a barrel. Let's try the X, Y, or Z axis. Which one will it be? Now, to smooth things out and get rid of those jagged edges, I'll increase the step setting on the screw modifier. Let's try 32 steps. That should smooth things out nicely. Okay, time to add a few loop cuts to make the faces more uniform. This will help prepare the model for the subdivision surface modifier. Sub D loves uniformity. We don't want it too round. We need some sharp edges where they belong. Here I'm selecting the edges that I want to crease to achieve that sharpness. Okay, now that we've selected the edges, we'll go to the end panel and find the crease slider. We'll turn that value up to 1 to define those edges as sharp creases. And let's not forget to add a bevel modifier. That'll give it that extra level of polish. I'll set the beveling method to weights and make sure to put bevel weight on those creased edges. Then I'll dial down the bevel amounts for a subtle effect. Alright, let's tackle the bottom part first. This should be the easiest section. We'll start by selecting the edge loop around the bottom opening. Simply Alt+, click on any edge along that boundary. Now we'll give this edge loop a crease value of 1 and a bevel weight of 1. You can do that in the Item tab of the Properties editor. Finally, to close up this hole, we'll press F to create a face. Moving on to the top lid, we'll start by selecting its boundary loop, just like we did for the bottom. Again, Alt+. Click on an edge along the top opening. Now we'll extrude these selected edges outward and upward. This will form a nice ridge for our lid. Press E to extrude, then move the new edges. Let's close this hole as well by pressing F to create a face. Next, we'll create some detail on the lid. We'll use the Inset tool twice, press I once for the first inset, and I again for the second. Finally, we'll select the innermost face we just created with the Inset tool and move it down slightly. This will give us a nice little step detail on the top of the lid. And don't forget the finishing touch. Let's apply that crease and bevel combination to the top lid's ridge as well, just like we did for the bottom, to really make it pop. Alright, let's add the cap for the lid. Switch to the top view, numpad 7. Shift+A to add a cylinder. Make sure to choose a 6-sided cylinder for this. Now position and scale that cylinder so it's perfectly aligned with the top lid. This will serve as our cap. Now let's go into edit mode. Select the bottom face of the cylinder and delete it. Then, select the newly exposed boundary edge loop. We'll extrude this loop outwards. I prefer to make this cap a separate floating piece, rather than directly modeling it onto the lid. This way, we avoid the complexities that come with working with a subdivided mesh. Next, we'll add some detail to the top of the cap. Use Ctrl+R on each of the 6 faces on top to add loop cuts. This will give us some edges to work with. Now select all of the top faces and press Ctrl+I to inset them. This creates a smaller hexagonal face within the larger one. To make this inset a perfect circle, right-click, go to Loop Tools. Make sure it's enabled in your preferences if you don't see it, and select Circle. Now to quickly transfer those modifier settings to the barrel, select the cylinder, then Shift, select the barrel. Press Ctrl+C and choose Copy Modifiers. This will copy all the modifiers from the cylinder onto the barrel. Finally, don't forget to set the crease and bevel weight for the cap's sharp edges to complete the look. Okay, now that we've copied the modifiers, let's refine the creasing. Go into Edit mode. We need to deselect any edges that we don't want to have the crease effect. Carefully select those edges and press Alt+Shift+A to deselect them. This will ensure that only the edges we intend to be sharp are creased. Now to create the screw top, select the center face of the cap and extrude it upwards. Press E to extrude, then move the face to create some height. Ctrl+J to join the cylinder with the barrel to eliminate visible seams between the floating object and the barrel. If the bevel on the cap still looks a bit too prominent, let's refine it. Simply decrease the bevel value to something that looks more suitable. A smaller value will create a less rounded, more subtle bevel. Just a few tiny adjustments on the top part, and I'm finished with the first barrel. Rename the barrel to barrel_high. This serves as my first high poly mesh for baking. Duplicate the barrel_high. I'm going to sculpt it a bit to create a damaged and beat up version. Switch to sculpt mode. Select the standard brush, invert its effect to negative, and then gently tap the surface until the barrel has a dent. Remember, just a slight touch. I want a dented look, not a destroyed one. Once the dent looks the way I want, rename the object to barrel_B_high. That's it for my second high poly mesh. So now we're going to duplicate our barrel_high. Let's rename that duplicate immediately to barrel_low. This is going to be our low poly version for baking, obviously. Alright, for this low poly, we're going to strip out most of the modifiers. Keep the weight normal modifier though, definitely want to keep that. Okay, now, let's simplify this thing. Going to select and delete some of these unnecessary loop cuts. Just get rid of some of the detail we don't need on the low poly. Right, now for the envelope. Let's select those loop faces, the ones that are kind of in the middle area, and press Shift+S to expand those faces. We want to expand them outwards so they almost envelope our high poly mesh. Yeah, it's actually better if it doesn't completely envelope the whole high poly mesh. Just kind of in the middle section will do the trick. Alright, moving on to the top part of our barrel_low. For that top section, let's just delete the faces we don't actually need. Like after that initial curve or drop off, we want the top faces to just go straight and flat, heading inwards towards the center of the barrel. And for the cap, yeah, for that I'm just going to reuse the floater we already have. I'm going to see if I can bridge some faces to connect it, make it all one piece-ish. Honestly, it doesn't have to be super neat or anything. Like this barrel is just a static prop, right? It's not some character with arms and legs that needs perfect edge loops for animation or something. As long as it bakes nicely and looks good in the end, then we're totally good to go. No need to overthink it. Set the smooth face to 180 and check in the normal weight modifier that keeps sharp on. Select loop cuts in the places where it has a 90-degree angle and mark sharp. And mark seams. My go-to is where there is a 90-degree angle changes in the surface. I need to mark it sharp and mark seams, but not always the places that have a seam should be marked sharp. Or something like that kinda. I continue in marking seams in place that not will be visible, but in this barrel's case I have no choice but to cut it in the middle and mark seams. Bear with me, just let me add another window. I work with 2 monitor, but need to show you guys how I UV it. Okay, hang on, let me show you. I use Mio 3 UV, it's a great tool for UVing objects. Basically, you just select an island and hit rectify. It makes the loops all flat and square. It'll make my life easier in Substance Painter later on. I want to get all these island loops flat, and for the loops on the sides, just select the island and choose Gridify. Flattens them right out. Now if you scroll down in Mio 3 UV, you'll see a display section. In there you can set the texture size. I'm going to make mine 4096. This is a UV checker basically, so you can spot any areas that haven't been UV'd properly, or if there's any weird stretching going on. For the second barrel, I'm just going to skip to the finish part since it's basically the same process as the first. The main difference is I left the loops on the side this time because I wanted to keep that damaged look. Now select both of your low poly objects. Then, go into Edit mode. In the UV Editor window, select all of the faces, make sure you've got everything. Select all the islands if they aren't already selected. Next, go up to the top toolbar of the UV Editor window. Finally, in that menu, click Average UV Island Scale and Pack. Alright, zoom in on the window there and just have a look around for anything strange, like islands overlapping. If you spot any overlaps, just repack it again and try making the margin bigger. But if it all looks clean though, we're good to move on. Now grab both of the barrels and export them to wherever you're saving things. I'm going to call it barrel_low. This is our low poly mesh that we'll be using in Substance. In the settings toolbar, you don't need to change anything, just keep it all default. Just double check that only selection is ticked though. Okay, time to export the high poly versions now, just like we did before. Pro tip, hide the low poly barrels first so you don't accidentally grab the wrong ones. Unhide and select the high polys, then export them to wherever you keep your files, and name it barrel_high. Remember that capital L and H thing. In barrel_low and barrel_high. That's how Substance figures out which is which mesh. Alright folks, that's a wrap on part 1 of the Red Barrel Game Asset Series. Part 2, the grand finale, hopefully soon, is on its way. Quick reminder before I bail, hit that like button, share it with your Blender buddies, and definitely subscribe to help a crazy guy out and keep these tutorials coming. See ya in the next video. Crazy signing off, and keep on blending.